Vivek, what's up? It's great to see you again. I'm glad to have you on the Will Cain podcast. I'd love to start with this. Can we start with a moment from this past week? Let's start with what happened at the headquarters of BlackRock, where climate protesters took over the lobby. A mob of people, signs, props, and chants about pillaging the earth. I feel like this moment leads me down so many topics and questions that I want to address with you. But I'll just open it up to you with, what did you think of protesters taking over the lobby of BlackRock?
It was not shocking to me, actually, Will. And the reason, it might be counterintuitive to a lot of folks who look at BlackRock and see a firm that is advancing one-sided progressive values, using their voting power, only to see progressives actually be the ones that raid their offices. And you have conservatives complaining in the body of civic discourse, but not really raiding the offices with pitchforks. It was literally with pitchforks. That came from the progressive movement. That might be surprising. It didn't surprise me, and here's why. I think their problem is deeper than just being a one-sided political vehicle. It is the fact that they have aggregated so much power and made political commitments with that power that even their failure to live up to those political commitments, or perceived to be failing to living up to those political commitments, creates an equal liability for them. So what do I mean? I mean, it happened. Let me just tell you exactly what happened, okay? Which is starting in about 2018. This is when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. There was this movement across capital markets in corporate America, financial institutions, where they said, well, if government leaders aren't going to step up to address this shared global challenge of climate change, then doggone it, we're going to have to do it ourselves. That's when CalPERS and the state of New York and other European funds, they went to institutions like BlackRock and others too, and they said that we're not going to do business with you unless you adopt a firm-wide commitment to use all of your money, not just our money, all of our money, to advance the goals of the Paris Climate Accords. Modern reverse diversity and inclusion standards, modern net zero emission standards, etc. And so these firms said, okay, we're going to do that. Now, the problem is they didn't just manage California and New York's money. They managed money from every other state as well, most of whom didn't want those agendas advanced. So this year you get to the point, now, I've been at the forefront of this for the last couple of years through my books and otherwise, and educating these audiences, and they've finally woken up to it. You have red states and others that have written to BlackRock saying that we think you're breaching your fiduciary duty to us. So 19 states attorney general a few months ago sent a letter to BlackRock saying that what I've been saying all along, you are using your voting power, using our shares to pressure oil and gas companies to produce less oil and gas. And they listed out a range of other fiduciary breaches that didn't advance their interests. BlackRock responded, this is quite recent now, in the last month or whatever, to those states attorney general. And they said, no, you guys are all mistaken. We're not really doing that. I think that was mostly BS. It was inaccurate, but this was their standard stock response. Within a week of that response, okay, comes New York's response, the New York City comptroller, who said that BlackRock's response was, this was his word, alarming. He said it's alarming because that ran afoul of the commitments you made to us in 2018, saying that's exactly what you were going to be doing. And so their problem basically is this, all right? If you're a $10 trillion asset manager, your goal is to stay a $10 trillion asset manager. And you're going to say anything to anyone to keep them happy. So if the blue guys are going to say that you need to advance these climate goals, by God, if you're going to let me keep your money, California, I'm going to do what you tell me to do. But the red guys started saying in the last year that they don't want that anymore, but they still want to keep that red state money. So they're saying, no, don't worry, guys. We don't really mean what we're saying to the blue team. But now the blue team's coming back and saying that, well, if you didn't really mean what you said to us, then we're going to storm your offices. So I know it's a little bit of complexity and it's a bit of a long story, but if you want to get to the heart of what's actually happening, that's what's going on. And, we can go into detail if that wasn't clear.
It's clear, but I do want to go into some further detail. I do want to make it just a bit more basic. So what we're talking about is Wall Street used as a weapon of politics. And I want to go into motivations in just one moment, but let's take two steps back. So for anyone listening who is not a Wall Street investor, who's not involved in finance and hedge funds, just in the most basic of terms possible, would you do this for me? Would you explain what it is that BlackRock does?
Sure. So they invest your money in the market generally in public companies, mostly through what you call index funds, which are funds that offer relatively low fees. They don't, in many of those funds, pick individual stocks. They just say you own the S&P 500, 500 of the largest US companies, or you own the energy sector. That they allow you to have that investment exposure by buying baskets of stocks in these funds. But they also vote your shares. So if you own a share in a company, you get three things. The most obvious is you get a financial entitlement, right? That's the part everybody knows. But as a shareholder, you also get a voice and a vote. So what's BlackRock doing? They're giving you an opportunity to use their funds to invest in America's companies. Disney, Exxon, Nike, Apple, whatever it might be, through their funds. They charge you a small fee to do that for you. But as part of that, they also are speaking on your behalf and voting your shares in ways that you may not know about. In fact, most Americans aren't aware that it's happening. And more recently, in the last few years, they've started voting those shares to force companies to adopt one-sided progressive political agendas to fight climate change, racial equity agendas, or quota systems in the boardroom. You wonder where that stuff comes from. A big part of where it comes from is your money is being used to tell those companies to adopt those agendas. When, let's just say Apple, or pick another company that made a 8 or 9 figure donation to Black Lives Matter, that's not using their money to do it. That is using your money to do it, because you, the shareholder of that company, are really the one who's an owner of that company's capital. So when that company uses its balance sheet or its money to advance a progressive political agenda, they're really using your money to do it. And BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street, they're like the intermediaries through which your money flows. That's the right way to think about it.
Okay, a couple more definitional questions for myself and the audience. Tell me what role and what is ESG?
Okay, so ESG is an acronym. It stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Factors. And it's an acronym that stands for two different behaviors in capital markets. The first behavior, which actually gets most of the airtime, though it's the smaller issue, is the investment of your money in ESG funds. Okay, so what ESG funds do is those are funds that exclude certain kinds of companies, maybe oil and gas companies, maybe tobacco companies, maybe gaming companies. They exclude certain so-called bad companies or industries, and then they include the so-called good industries or companies, wind, solar, whatever the case might be. U.S. tech companies are favored darlings of many ESG funds. So that's the first thing they do, is ESG funds screen in and screen out stocks based on including more of the good guys and excluding the bad guys. This gets a lot of attention, Will, I have to say, and there's a lot of problems with it. My first book, Woke Inc., details some of those issues. Turns out that ESG funds, one of the problems is an inconvenient one for them, ESG funds have dramatically underperformed the market this year, especially underperforming sectors like oil and gas, which they've excluded. And that's not an accident. But in the scheme of things, this is not a huge problem, in my opinion, because it's only a tiny portion of the total capital invested in markets that's invested in ESG funds. I think it's less than 2% of the money that BlackRock manages is invested in their ESG specific funds. Now let's talk about the bigger problem. The bigger problem isn't what they're doing with their ESG funds. It's what they're doing with their supposedly non-ESG funds. All the other funds that were invested in the normal labeled funds that weren't labeled as ESG funds, that were just funds where the people who put money in them thought they were investing in them to make money, when in fact, the thing they're doing with all of those other funds, the other 98%, is they're still using ESG principles to decide how they vote your shares in corporate America.
Okay.
That's what I call green smuggling. Okay, so the people who put money in ESG funds, I don't have too much sympathy in the sense that if you put your money into an ESG fund, that's what you thought you were getting. Okay. Now, if somebody else did that without your permission, okay, I think you might have a case against them. But if you knowingly put your money into an ESG fund, you knew what you were getting. But I think the root surprise is when you put your money in just a normal S&P 500 index fund, or you just put your money in a normal total stock market index fund where you just think you're buying stocks for the sake of owning stocks, but that money is used to vote and to demand that those boards adopt one-sided political values, that's the real betrayal. And that's not small scale. That's happening at a multi-tens of trillion dollar scale. I think it's the biggest financial breach, fiduciary breach. I would go so far as to call it even a financial fraud of the 21st century. And it's hiding in plain sight. So far, no one, I think save for, I think that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now. But very few people have stepped up to address this. And I think it is an important gap that needs to be closed because, there's an election coming up and everything else. People, it's certainly very important to vote in November. I'll be voting in this election. I'm sure you will be too. But you don't just vote every November. You vote every day with your investment dollars, whether or not you know it. You're literally voting in corporate America. And I think that's something that Americans would do well to wake up to.
Let's stay on that note. And one more definitional question then. Let's use BlackRock as a proxy. You mentioned Vanguard and State Street as well, but we use BlackRock as an illustration. You mentioned 10 trillion. Give me an example of the size of assets under management at a firm like BlackRock.
Yeah, so it varies. The market's down a little bit, so maybe it's dipped a little bit below 10 trillion now, but it's between 8 and 11 trillion dollars. Okay.
And here's why I asked that.
It's almost half the size of the U.S. GDP. Just to give you the scale of capital under the management of one firm.
Wow. Okay, and here's why I'm now narrowing in on some specificity here, taking us back to your original answer. Of that $8 to $11 trillion under management for BlackRock, in your estimation, and I don't know that you have this at your fingertips, what percentage of their portfolio would be what percentage of their client base would be attributable to public sector pension funds like CalPERS or New York? In essence, how much power and how much direction of BlackRock's investments are these now much more political entities wielding within BlackRock?
It's a good question, Will. So I don't have those numbers at my fingertips. I'm not even sure they're publicly available. This would be a good question for BlackRock. But I can tell you qualitatively, a lot of that capital is definitely going to have come from politicized actors like California and New York who want to use their capital as a weapon. But I am going to give you a strong hypothesis and educated guess that that's a minority of the total capital they manage. And so what this becomes then is a tyranny of the minority, where what happens is that it's like what you see happening on Twitter, but via the capital markets, right? What a small vocal minority does or says dictates the way that everyone else's voice is still exercised. And what happened is I'd say a lot of red states were asleep at the switch when they got dragged along for the ride. If I'm to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of them still are asleep at the switch. Now, what happened was, if you put yourself in BlackRock's shoes, they say, okay, it's like many CEOs across corporate America too, but put yourself in BlackRock's shoes, just to be as sympathetic as we can. You got the loud clients over here, CalPERS from California and everyone else like them, that says, okay, we need to adopt the Paris Climate Accords, and we need to make sure we're forcing companies to adopt emission standards and board quotas based on race and gender. And then everyone else is just staying quiet and not saying anything. What they say is, well, our clients are demanding it. Well, it's not really, it's some of your clients, but it's not all of them. Now, there's also concentration effect here, though, Will, because California is a big client. So it's not a majority or anywhere close to it's like not even close to a majority of BlackRock's assets under management, but they're a relatively bigger client. But that's because most of their clients, there's, orders of magnitude more, but they're each smaller, right? So some of this is a collective action problem. So I think what we need to see happen is that at minimum, what I'm going to describe here as a minimum solution, right? I think those red states need to get together and say, hey, we are going to call our proxy voting power back. We'll vote our own proxies. And then they have an organized way to do it that says we're going to do it based on fiduciary principles, not ESG principles, not political principles. And the problem I see in the red states right now is that you've just got a managerial class that is too lazy and has too much inertia to make that happen. But this is a solvable problem. that if the red states in this country, and certainly I think most purple states are on board with this too, took back all of their proxy voting power and said we would vote our proxies, vote our shares in a way that said companies should make products and services for profit and make money, pretty simple idea, that alone would change the dynamic in corporate America, let alone what they really should do is just move their money to other kinds of firms.
Well, that suggestion leads me then to my final question on ESG and BlackRock and the use of investment vehicles as political weapons. And that is one of motivation. I firmly believe, and have talked about here on the Will Cain podcast, of the power of a small, strident minority all throughout our economic and social and cultural system. I have firmly come to believe in the power of a small minority as your explanation for the behavior of, for example, BlackRock. But if, say, Texas or a coalition of red states said, you'll continue to manage our investment, but we want our voting proxy back, and we will vote ourselves on these various corporate issues. BlackRock, you would think, would be happy with that arrangement if they're only bowing to the minority, the vocal small minority of CalPERS and New York, because, as you said, which I buy, a $10 trillion investment vehicle wants to remain a $10 trillion investment vehicle, and it wants to make money, and it wants to do what's best in its fiduciary duty, if a fiduciary duty is its primary purpose. So this is the question. You would think BlackRock would be like, cool, yes, red states, you can have your vote proxy back, unless they're not a true fiduciary duty, unless they are not just bowing to a vocal small minority, unless they are true believers of these policies. And therefore, my final question to you was one of motivation. Again, we'll focus on BlackRock. They are who is in the news, and quite honestly, they are who is most well known. When we see their investment choices and the power they wield through their dollar, are they doing it? Is Larry Fink doing it because he is bending to CalPERS, or is he doing it because he believes that these are the things he wants to do and the outcomes he wants to effectuate on the world?
So it's a great question, Will. I think the answer is both. Okay, one reinforces and serves as a justification for the other at the top. Now, I think there are a lot of other firms, and I've met a lot of these guys over time, of other asset managers and CEOs of large asset managers. Many of them privately disagree with the approach that their firms are taking, but recognize that they would be uncompetitive in bidding for CalPERS and California Capital if they didn't. But I think in Larry Fink's case, and I may meet him at some point. I haven't met him in person yet, so, I haven't talked to him about politics. But my strong sense is that these reflect his personal beliefs as well. And so I think that sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that the hypocrisy is worse. In fact, I think that between the two, the use of capital as a weapon to foist your views on society intentionally while avoiding any democratic accountability might actually even be the more frightening of the two, though both are quite bad. Yeah. But, the blunt answer to the question is there isn't a clean answer to that question, because all the way down, it's really both. And it depends on the firm you're talking about.
I want to take a minute now and ask you about your book, Nation of Victims. And I want to ask you about a couple of different concepts, if we can, in the limited time that we have here together. First of all, talk to me about, the entire book is premised on the concept of victimhood, but let's not hit the piñata where it's easiest. Instead, let's go to the areas where we are most challenged. And I say we as me and many of the audience, on the beliefs that we already subscribe. Okay? Talk to me about conservative victimhood.
Yeah, this is probably one of the more important chapters of the book. I think that my concern is that the way this culture war ends is not with a bang, but with a whimper. And what I mean by that is that both sides may become infected by some of the same values while continuing to fight one another, even though they actually fight for the same cause. And I worry when I see on the left, and I've written about this and spoken about this extensively. I talk about it in the book. I have a chapter in the book about Black victimhood. The worry that we see ourselves as victims of our race or of our sexual orientation, of the genetically inherited characteristics that we inherit on the day we're born. And I'm very critical of that. But I worry that the right's response, the response of the conservative movement, is increasingly becoming to say that, well, you know what, you think you're a victim? Well, guess what? I'm an even bigger victim because here's all the bad things that have happened to me. And then we end up in this grievance Olympics, this victimhood Olympics, this oppression Olympics, where there is no gold medalist. It is America as a nation that loses in the end. If there is a gold medalist, I'll tell you who it is. It is China. And I worry that that's the direction that I see the Republican Party heading in, as opposed to a movement and a political party representing it that say we're going to contrast ourselves from the victimhood narrative, saying that, you know what, there's a lot of reasons we could see ourselves as victims. One of the things I do in that chapter is I detail why I think the case for conservative victimhood is strong.
Right.
We made economic policy choices in this country. And so I go to great lengths.
So you're not denying the existence. And just to be clear then, Vivek, you're not denying the existence or a rightful claim to victimhood, which is nothing anyone should aspire. But when you see media censorship or whatever it may be, there's a legitimate case for victimhood, right? But that is almost beside the point, to your point.
Exactly, because you know what? If this were the left-wing version of this podcast, I could make the case. You know, I know what they'd be saying. Okay, and there's not, and some of it, there's kernels of truth to it. Well, I mean, a history of redlining in this country, a war on drugs that was inequitably borne by the black community and black fathers that led to that crisis of fatherlessness, that led to black kids having the cycle of poor education and poverty in the inner cities. I mean, whatever. Everyone can sort of share their version of the narrative, and there are kernels of truth to each. I'm happy to be more sympathetic in recent years to the case for conservative victimhood as laid out. I think in bare truth by Donald Trump in his 2016 presidential election, there's a lot of truth to it. But at some point, and I think we're at that point, we're going to have to decide what we're going to do about it. And if it's not going to be the fact that we're going to look ourselves in the mirror, say that, yes, we've encountered hardship, but hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Hardship is an occasion to teach ourselves and remind ourselves of who we are. And instead we go in the direction of wallowing in our own victimhood narrative. That is truly the beginning of our national decline. And I trace a lot of this to even ancient Roman history. I mean, this is a telltale sign of the decline of a great nation, the decline of a great empire, the decline of a great republic, is when the individuals begin to start worrying about how to divide the pie rather than and abandon their concern for how to actually grow it. Then we go back to doing what human beings have always done. And America isn't supposed to be that country. I think America is a country where we can aspire to excellence, not denying the hardships that present themselves along the way, whether we're on our left or on the right. But I worry that, I mean, the Democratic Party is beyond hope. But if our last best hope is for a conservative movement in response to that distinguishes itself not by the nature of the victimhood claims we make, but through our abandonment of victimhood and our embrace of excellence itself, that's the direction I'd like to see the conservative movement go. And, you know, I think between the two, it's definitely the political party or the movement that has a better chance of doing it.
What is your theory, another chapter in your book, Nation of Victims, what is your theory of duty?
Yeah. So the title of the chapter is called A Theory of Duty. It is a play on John Rawls's famous work, A Theory of Justice, which was sort of the intellectual centerpiece of the left for much of the latter half of the 20th century. But my view here is this is, as I like to call it sometimes, this is our missing shade of red in the conservative movement. Okay, I think that, yes, there's a part of each of us, probably you and me too included, Will, as part of every American's identity, that we want to be that rugged individual that pursues our own dreams, that pursues our own destiny, expressed through the system of free market capitalism, the American dream, the rugged individual. That's an important part of my identity as an American. It's an important part of our collective identity as Americans. But I think if we're being honest about it, there's a different side to our heart as well, a side to us that wants to be part of a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. The desire for unity that transcends just those individualistic dreams and pursuits. And I think that's the beauty, that's the paradox at the heart of American identity, right? Individualism and unity, capitalism and democracy. 1776, not just the year of the wealth of nations or the Declaration of Independence, it was the year of both of them. And I think that one of the things that we sort of are a little bit reluctant, a little shy about, almost even a little uncomfortable in talking about in the conservative movement is the revival of this notion of civic duty. That, yes, I am, as an individual, a capitalist and free to realize my dreams, but I also have an identity as this thing called a citizen. It means something to not just be a person roaming around an economic system, but a citizen of a nation. And being a citizen of a nation comes not just with rights, but with duties, with responsibilities. And I'm about to say something that that I couldn't imagine that I would have said even 10 years ago. But I think that while I stop short of believing in mandatory government mandated military service, I would like to see our country move towards at least a non-mandated cultural presumptive norm in favor of universal military service, like you have in Israel. I think that can be the American. Israel's government mandates it, and I think that we can. I think that we ought to embrace that as conservatives, actually. And I think that the crowd that says, "Oh no, that's an infringement on liberty," and it's just about liberty all the way down. I mean, you're going to be hard pressed to find a greater advocate for human and individual liberty than I. But it's conflating two different spheres of our lives, and I think that it is the fulfillment of our duties as a citizen that allows us to be free, both as individuals and as a people. And we don't talk about that enough. And I think some people privately, I would talk to political leaders and otherwise, they'll nod their heads. They won't say a word about it in public because they're scared. And I think that we need to be able to actually revive that conversation, the duties of citizenship, the meaning of what it means to not just be a person, but a citizen of a nation. I think that's something that's a missing piece of the conversation in our public discourse today that I didn't want to be shy about.
Vivek, I would stand and give you a round of applause if I could, if it would be effective on a digital removal here at two separate locations that we are podcast. I love what you just had to say. I think you're exactly right that the inherent American tension is between rugged individualism and a sense of communitarianism, of unity, of being a part of something bigger than yourself. I don't believe either that it is compulsive military service. I love the idea of a cultural norm, and I love that you introduced that into this conversation. I want to be sensitive to your time, so I'm going to end our conversation with one note of current event. You and I had a conversation on Fox and Friends weekend about this, and I would love for you to quickly explain your theory. Elon Musk has said he may cut 75% of Twitter staff, something that was explained to me, by the way, during the original purchase agreement by his former PayPal founder David Sachs, which is fascinating in of itself how a company can be 75% fat. That in and of itself is of note and fascinating. But the idea that the government will now investigate Starlink and Twitter and Elon Musk in general as a national security risk, that's what has been suggested could be taking place out of the Biden administration, is alarming. And yet on Fox and Friends weekend, you, Vivek Ramaswamy, had a very fascinating theory that makes it, I don't know, maybe even more alarming, but not for the reasons we might be realizing.
Yes. So, look, I think that Elon Musk does not want to buy Twitter, and President Biden does not want Elon Musk to buy Twitter for different reasons. I think Elon Musk has proven to be an expert at government lobbying, both in the United States and in other nations. In fact, both Tesla and SpaceX quite likely would not exist as successful businesses if it were not for the use of public funding, either through subsidies through the electric car industry or through actual government contracting in the case of SpaceX. Elon Musk has, I think, demonstrated his willingness to change his political tunes based on the favors that he gets to be able to do business in China. I mean, you think about his recent comments on Taiwan. And by the way, the preface I offer, I'm assuming everyone knows this, I'm a big fan of Elon and his technical achievements. I am a big advocate of his vision of turning Twitter into a free speech platform, but I also don't believe in, in simple-minded narratives that you have, therefore, if someone's doing the right thing, they're to be trusted in every respect of what they're doing. I think what he said about Taiwan was deeply concerning, that Taiwan should somehow annex itself voluntarily to China as a special administrative region. I think he is dead wrong all the way down from an American interests perspective. Yet, as soon as he does it, Tesla gets a tax break in China. They have a large production factory in Shanghai. That's something that Elon Musk and Larry Fink have in common. If the CCP says jump, they will ask how high. And so at the end of the day, I worry a little bit that an expert at using governments to advance his private ends may be making one last ditch attempt to actually get himself out of the Twitter deal. He's trying to do it in Delaware court. Does not look like his odds are great. He signed a binding definitive merger agreement, came up with this theory about the bots. I never found that persuasive. How could he say that his reason to buy Twitter was to get rid of the bots. I mean, that's what he said on the day of the announcement. This was one of his number one goals. I thought it was a noble goal. Yet said that actually that became the reason why he wanted to get out of the deal. That fell flat. Didn't look like it was going to work in court. I think it's entirely plausible. It's his last-ditch attempt to raise these security risks that gives Biden an out that stops a free speech platform advocate from owning Twitter when that free speech platform advocate doesn't want to own Twitter because he overpaid for it. And I think that that's, I think that that could be a confluence of interests that would not at all be surprising. It would not at all be surprising with respect to the relations that large influential business leaders like Elon have had with the Chinese government. It's no surprise to see that playing out here in the United States as well. Now, do I think it's going to be successful? I don't think that that's likely. I mean, it would be a significant blow to the rule of law in the United States if that's exactly how this played out, that the U.S. government somehow blocked this transaction. But if you're President Biden, it's certainly more convenient for you to have someone in charge of Twitter that actually removes the people that you tell them to remove. Alex Berenson, he's a critic of the government. Let's take him off. Great. It's great to have a management team that's actually responsive to what you, the government, can't do directly. Elon Musk isn't going to be that guy, at least not reliably so. And both of them, even though they're on opposite sides of the free speech question, could have different agendas that put them in the proverbial room where it happened. So I don't think it's likely to be successful because it would deal such a blow to the rule of law. And I do have general faith in our judicial system. If I had to pick one frontier that still has my trust in our federal government, and for example, the state judicial systems in Delaware too. But it smacked to me of something that smelled of a confluence of interests that may sound cynical, but I think the interests were too plain not to comment on.
It's a fascinating theory. And at the very least, I think it's a good reminder to be careful who you pick as your heroes. And even then, be careful how much you devote to your heroes. Vivek Ramaswamy, so insightful. Great conversation as always. Thank you for the time you gave us today.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.